close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let the weight of this moment, of this quiet room and this quiet hour, settle gently into your limbs, into your shoulders, into the soft space behind your eyes. Breathe slowly, in through the nose and out through the mouth, and let the breath carry away whatever small tensions have gathered there over the course of this long, long day. You have nothing to do now, nowhere to be. The world outside your window is doing perfectly well without you for these next few hours. And so you may simply rest and listen and allow your thoughts to soften and dissolve like candle smoke drifting toward a darkened ceiling. We are going to travel together, you and this voice, back through the centuries, back through the long quiet corridors of history, to a place and a time that feels very far away, and in its very distance, very safe, like a story told to you by an old and gentle scholar who sits beside your bed in a chair worn smooth by years of sitting, reading by the light of a single flame. That place is Italy, and that time is the late 15th century, and the story is one of a family whose name has drifted down through the ages like incense on the air of an old cathedral, heavy, mysterious, and impossible to fully explain. If this voice helps you rest tonight, consider subscribing to this channel. But only if you are still awake, only if your eyes are still willing to flutter open for one more moment before sleep takes them. And if you are already drifting, then simply let the words become a river, flowing slowly beneath you, carrying you forward without effort. We begin now. We begin in Italy. We begin with the Borgias. It was the year 1431, and it was the place of Zataiva, a modest town nestled in the fertile lowlands of Valencia, in the kingdom of Aragon, on the eastern coast of what we now call Spain. That a child was born into a family of modest but respectable standing, a child whose life would eventually touch the highest seat of power in all of Christendom. The child was named Rodrigo de Borgia, in the Spanish manner of his family, though history would eventually render that name in the Italian form, Borgia. And it is under that Italian name that he would become one of the most talked about and most debated figures of the entire Renaissance period. The Borgia family were not nobility in the grandest sense, but they were people of standing, people with connections, people who understood that in the world of 15th century Iberia, the church was not merely a spiritual institution, but a ladder, a long and gilded ladder whose uppermost rungs touched the very heavens, and whose lower rungs were accessible to any family clever enough and devout enough, or perhaps ambitious enough, to place a son upon the first step. Rodrigo would be that son. He was, by most accounts of the period, a child of considerable natural gifts, an ease with language, a warmth of manner, a physical presence that would later be described by contemporaries as commanding and even magnetic, though history has not preserved for us any detailed portrait of his early years in Valencia. The family's fortunes took a decisive turn, as family fortunes so often do in the history of ambitious clans, when a well-placed relative rose to unexpected prominence. Rodrigo's maternal uncle was Alfonso de Borja, who had already established himself in the church as a man of learning, political skill, and genuine theological intelligence. And when Alfonso was elevated to the cardinalate in 1444, the trajectory of the entire Borgia family shifted as if a great river had been quietly redirected by the accumulation of silt and stone over many patient years. Alfonso's elevation brought Rodrigo to Rome, brought him into the sphere of Italian ecclesiastical education, brought him to the university at Bologna, where he studied canon law with the diligence and apparent aptitude of a young man who understood that knowledge was currency, that a well-turned legal argument was as powerful as any sword and that the long corridors of the Vatican were navigated most successfully by those who understood both the letter of church law and the unspoken grammar of papal politics. It is worth noting that Bologna in this period was one of the oldest and most prestigious centres of legal learning in all of Europe, and the young Rodrigo would have been surrounded by scholars from across the continent, from France and Germany, from England and Castile, all gathered together in a city of red brick and autumn light, sharpening their minds against the ancient texts of Roman jurisprudence. Meanwhile, the world of Rome in the middle of the 15th century was a world in which the boundaries between the sacred and the secular had grown wonderfully and sometimes dangerously permeable. The Renaissance was not yet in its full flowering, but its roots were already deep and spreading, and the great families of Italy, the Sforza of Milan, the Medici of Florence, the Este of Ferrara, the Orsini and the Colonna of Rome itself, were all engaged in a slow, complex, and endlessly shifting dance of alliance and rivalry that involved marriages and betrayals, artistic patronage and military campaigns, the careful accumulation of land, and the equally careful management of reputation. It was into this world that Rodrigo Borgia, freshly educated and newly ordained, stepped in the early 1450s, armed with his uncle's influence, his own considerable charm, and an appetite for the possibilities that Rome represented that would prove, over the following decades, to be very nearly insatiable. In 1456, when Alfonso de Borgia became Pope Calixtus III, the elevation of the entire Borgia family reached a new and dizzying height, and Rodrigo was appointed to the cardinalate at the age of just 25. An appointment that shocked some, delighted others, and set the young Spaniard upon a path from which there would be no turning back. The appointment of a 25-year-old to the rank of cardinal was not, in the context of the 15th century, entirely without precedent, though it was certainly remarkable, and it spoke both to the power of papal nepotism and to the genuine estimation in which Rodrigo was held by those who had encountered him in the halls of Vatican diplomacy. He was made Cardinal Deacon of San Nicola in Carcere, and not long afterward he was appointed Vice-Chancellor of the Holy Roman Church, a position of extraordinary administrative importance that he would hold for the next 35 years across the pontificates of 5 different popes, demonstrating a political resilience and an institutional knowledge that was, whatever else one might say about him, genuinely impressive. During this long tenure as Vice-Chancellor, Rodrigo administered the enormous and complex machinery of papal governance. The correspondence, the benefices, the legal disputes, the financial arrangements, the management of distant dioceses and far-flung monasteries. And he did so with a thoroughness and an energy that even his critics were occasionally forced to acknowledge. It was also during these years, the quiet decades of administration and accumulation, that Rodrigo Borgia began to build, stone by patient stone, the personal fortune and the network of obligations and loyalties that would eventually make him, in the summer of 1492, a very credible candidate for the throne of St. Peter. The woman who would become most closely associated with the private life of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia was a Roman lady named Vanozza Catanei, born in 1442, whose relationship with the cardinal began sometime in the late 1460s or early 1470s, and who would bear him at least 4 children who survived to adulthood, children whose names would become, in their own time, some of the most famous and most debated names in all of European history. Vanozza was not a woman of great social standing, but she was by all accounts a woman of intelligence and practical competence, who managed her own affairs with some success, and who maintained a degree of public respectability, even while her private connection to one of the most powerful men in Rome was known, if not exactly spoken of openly, in the particular way that such things are known and not spoken of in societies, where appearances and realities have learned to coexist with a certain polite discretion. It was Rodrigo and Vanozza who brought into the world in 1475 a son named Cesare, and then in 1476 another son named Giovanni, and then in 1478 a son named Joffre, and then in April of 1480, in the city of Rome, a daughter who was baptized with the name Lucrezia, a name that would eventually carry, in the imagination of later centuries, a weight of legend and notoriety so heavy and so elaborate that the real woman beneath it has sometimes been difficult to see at all. Lucrezia Borgia arrived in the world on the 18th of April, 1480, in Rome, and grew up in circumstances that were, by any measure, unusual. Her father was one of the most powerful ecclesiastical figures in Europe, a man of vast wealth and far-reaching connections, who kept his children close, educated them carefully, dressed them beautifully, and made no particular effort to conceal his paternal pride in them, even as church law formally prohibited the clergy from acknowledging natural children. Her early years were spent partly in the care of her mother, Vanozza, and partly in the household of her father's cousin, a woman named Adriana da Mila, who served as a kind of official guardian and hostess for the cardinal's household, providing a veneer of social propriety over arrangements that were, at their core, the domestic life of a man who had never permitted the formal requirements of his vocation to entirely constrain the appetites of his nature. Lucrezia grew up surrounded by art and music, by the sound of Latin and Italian, by the constant movement of important men through magnificent rooms, by the smells of beeswax candles and expensive cloth, and the particular dusty fragrance of old books. And she was educated, as was increasingly the fashion among the elite families of Renaissance Italy, in letters and languages, in music and deportment, in all the graces that would make her a suitable bride for a man of consequence. Over the next few years, as Lucrezia moved through childhood and into the first years of adolescence, the political world of Italy grew steadily more complicated, more fraught with the accumulated tensions of competing ambitions, and her father, Rodrigo, grew steadily more focused on the one prize that had, for years, been glittering at the edge of his vision. The papacy was not an office that a man of ambition simply waited to receive. It was an office that had to be prepared for, cultivated toward, approached through the patient management of alliances and the careful distribution of favors, and the maintenance of a reputation that was, if not spotlessly virtuous, at least not so thoroughly compromised as to make election impossible. Rodrigo was not spotlessly virtuous. He was known to have children, known to have appetites, known to have accumulated wealth and influence through means that the more austere among his contemporaries regarded with varying degrees of unease. But he was also known to be competent and generous and politically reliable, and in the particular arithmetic of a papal conclave in the 15th century. These qualities weighed heavily in his favor, perhaps more heavily than any abstract consideration of personal sanctity. The conclave that would change everything opened in August of 1492 in the Sistine Chapel in Rome, following the death of Pope Innocent V on the 25th of July of that year, and it brought together 36 cardinals who had gathered, in the time-honored fashion, to elect a new successor to St. Peter. The summer of 1492 was a summer of remarkable historical density. In that same August, Christopher Columbus was preparing his fleet in the Spanish port of Palos de la Frontera for a voyage westward across the Atlantic Ocean, and the last Moorish kingdom of Granada had fallen to the Spanish crown in January of that year, and in Florence, the great Lorenzo de' Medici had died only a few months before, leaving a power vacuum in that city that would ripple outward across Italy for years to come. The world was shifting, turning, rearranging itself in ways that no one could entirely foresee. And in the Sistine Chapel, lit by the soft, uncertain light of candles, and warmed by the August heat of Rome, 36 aging men in red robes engaged in the solemn and complex and not entirely transparent process of choosing the man who would speak for God on earth. Rodrigo Borgia emerged from that conclave on the night of the 10th and 11th of August, 1492, as Pope Alexander VI, elected by a bare two-thirds majority, amid persistent rumours of simony, the purchase of votes with promises of benefices, appointments, and other ecclesiastical favours that would follow his pontificate like a shadow. The Rome that greeted the new pope was a city of startling contrasts, a city where extraordinary beauty and ordinary squalor existed in such close proximity that the distance between them could sometimes be measured in the width of a single narrow street. The great basilicas and the new constructions of the Renaissance stood alongside medieval tenements and ancient ruins, and the population of perhaps 60,000 souls was divided sharply between those who moved in the upper reaches of ecclesiastical or noble society and those who scraped their living from the margins of both. It was into this city, this layered and complicated and endlessly fascinating city, that Alexander VI arrived as its supreme spiritual and temporal authority, and he arrived with his children, the brilliant and dangerous Cesare, the politically useful Giovanni, and the luminous and already talked about Lucrezia, positioned at his side, prepared to be deployed in the service of a family ambition that was, by the summer of 1492, no longer merely personal, but thoroughly papal. The story of what happened next, in those sun-bleached Roman streets and candlelit Vatican chambers, in the great halls and the quiet antechambers, and the garden loggia, where the evening air carried the mingled fragrance of jasmine and the distant smell of the Tiber, is a story that has been told many times, in many registers, and it is a story that continues to resist easy summary, because the people at its centre were too complicated, and the times in which they lived too strange and too rich, to be reduced to simple moral categories of good and evil, victim and predator, saint and poisoner. Cesare Borgia was born in 1475, the eldest surviving son of Rodrigo and Vanozza Catanei, and from an early age he was marked, by those who observed him closely, as a person of quite extraordinary gifts and quite extraordinary will. He was educated at the University of Perugia, and later at the University of Pisa, where he studied canon law with a seriousness that impressed his teachers. And he displayed, alongside his academic aptitude, a physical vitality and a martial instinct that was somewhat unusual in a young man being prepared for a career in the church. His father, with the logic of a politician thinking several moves ahead, had intended Cesare for the ecclesiastical life from the beginning. A son in the church was a son whose position could be reinforced by the power of the papacy itself, whose advancement required no battles or inheritances, and whose influence could be extended across the vast geographic network of the Roman Church. But Cesare himself, it seems, had rather different instincts. Instincts that pointed not toward the quiet life of the scholar priest, but toward something more active, more physical, more dangerous. He was described by contemporaries as tall, as handsome, as possessing a kind of charged energy that made rooms feel different when he entered them. And the chroniclers of the period noted, with a mixture of admiration and unease, that he was equally comfortable in the presence of a pope and in the presence of a soldier, equally fluent in the language of theology and the language of threat. When Alexander VI became pope in August of 1492, Cesare was 17 years old and already a bishop, having been appointed Bishop of Pamplona in 1491 by his father's influence, and in September of 1493, at the age of 18, he was made a cardinal by his newly elevated father, an appointment that continued the Borgia tradition of advancing family members to positions of ecclesiastical power that their youth and their personal histories might not, in an ideal world, have recommended them for. As a cardinal, Cesar found himself in Rome during a period of intense political maneuvering, when the great powers of Europe, France under Charles die, Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella, the various Italian city-states, in their perpetually shifting configurations, were all pressing against the boundaries of the peninsula with varying degrees of urgency. And when the papacy under Alexander was engaged in a delicate and sometimes desperate effort to preserve its temporal power while simultaneously managing its spiritual authority. Charles V of France descended into Italy in 1494, and his army moved southward through the peninsula with a speed and a force that left the established political order badly shaken. And Cesare, who was still nominally a cardinal, though his heart was clearly elsewhere, served as a papal legate in the negotiations and the movements that followed, gaining his first real experience of the world beyond the Vatican walls, beyond the gentle rhythms of ceremonial and scholarship, in a world where power was exercised through armies and threats, and the rapid movements of men on horseback through a landscape that was at once beautiful and deeply dangerous. During this period, the quiet scratch of a quill in a Roman palazzo and the distant toll of a church bell at matins were the sounds against which all these larger dramas played themselves out. The question of Cesare's eventual departure from the cardinalate, his abandonment of the church for the life of a soldier and a lord, is one of those moments in Renaissance history where the personal and the political become so thoroughly entangled that it is almost impossible to separate one from the other. And it unfolded across the years 1497 and 1498, a series of events that combined genuine family tragedy with the calculated maneuvering of a father and son who understood, perhaps better than anyone else in Italy at the time, how to transform even grief into political advantage. In June of 1497, Cesare's brother Giovanni, the Duke of Gandia, was murdered in Rome, his body found in the Tiber, stabbed multiple times, on the morning of the 15th of June. And this murder, which shocked even the hardened political class of Rome, was never officially solved, though suspicion fell upon Cesare almost immediately, and has never entirely lifted, because Giovanni's death was in many respects quite convenient for a brother who had long chafed against his ecclesiastical constraints, and who stood to inherit, with Giovanni gone, a much larger share of his father's attention and his father's plans. Historians believe, though they cannot definitively prove, that Cesare was responsible for his brother's death, and the evidence that survives, scattered across the diplomatic dispatches and private letters of the period, suggests at minimum that the question was not considered settled even at the time, that contemporaries looked at Cesare with a particular kind of wariness that spoke of things suspected and not spoken. In the year 1498, Cesare formally renounced the cardinalate, the first cardinal in the history of the church to do so and stepped into secular life with a decisiveness that suggested the step had been contemplated for some time. His father arranged for him a title and a marriage that would anchor him to the political world of France, which Alexander had been carefully cultivating as an ally in the complex Italian balance of power. Cesare was made Duke of Valentinois by Louis XII of France, and he married a French noblewoman named Charlotte d'Albret, sister of the King of Navarre, in a union that was clearly political in its conception, though it seems to have been, by the brief accounts that survive, personally agreeable to both parties. Charlotte d'Albret was described as gentle and accomplished, and she was, by all accounts, entirely suitable to be the wife of a man of Cesare's rank and ambition, though the marriage would prove, for reasons of geography and politics, that neither of them had fully anticipated to be almost immediately a thing of letters rather than of daily life, as Cesare's attention turned rapidly southward, back toward Italy and back toward the business of conquest and domination that was already reshaping the map of central Italy. It was the year 1498. It was the city of Paris, and it was the beginning of an alliance that would have consequences neither France nor the papacy could have entirely predicted in a period when the consequences of alliances had a way of multiplying with the particular quiet inevitability of slow-acting substances working their way through a warm body at a banquet. The substance most closely associated with the Borgia family in the historical imagination and in a remarkable number of the diplomatic dispatches and private letters of the period was a compound known as cantarella, a word whose etymology historians continue to debate, with some suggesting it derives from the Spanish word for a small song or a gentle melody, and others proposing connections to the Latin cantharides, the blister beetles, whose extract had been known since antiquity for its powerful and dangerous biological effects. Whatever its name meant, cantarella's reputation was formidable, and the descriptions of it that survive in the chronicles and letters of the period paint a picture of a white powder with a pleasant taste, or sometimes a pale substance dissolved in wine that could be administered at a banquet or a diplomatic reception without arousing immediate suspicion, and whose effects, depending on the dose and the constitution of the recipient, might manifest over days or weeks rather than hours, lending to any subsequent death the plausible deniability of natural illness. It is worth noting that arsenic, which most historians believe, was the primary active ingredient in whatever compound cantarella actually was well known in the 15th century as a rat poison, and had been used in various forms since at least the Roman period, when its properties and its dangers were already documented in the medical literature. The skill in its use, contemporaries understood, lay not in knowing of its existence. That knowledge was fairly widely distributed, but in knowing how to calibrate the dose with sufficient precision that the dying resembled the natural dying that everyone in that pre-modern world was already so familiar with. The social world in which poison, real or rumoured, operated most effectively was a world of extraordinary formal hospitality, a world in which the banquet was not merely a meal, but a political theatre of the first order, in which the arrangement of guests at table communicated hierarchies of favour and disfavour, in which the quality of the food and wine announced the wealth and the taste of the host, and in which the act of eating and drinking together was understood. In a world without chemical analysis, to imply a trust that could never be entirely verified. The great halls of Roman palaces in the 1490s, the Palazzo Borgia on the Borgo Nuovo, the Castel Sant'Angelo that served as fortress and treasury, an occasional residence for the papal family, the various villas and country houses where the heat of Roman summers was escaped in favor of cooler hillside air, were places where some of the most consequential conversations of the age took place over silver plates and crystal goblets, and the quiet music of a lute played in an adjacent room, and where the presence of a powerful cardinal or a duke or an ambassador was secured by the promise of good food, good wine, and the social warmth of an attentive host who seemed, at least for the duration of the evening, to have no other concern than the pleasure and the comfort of his guests. It was this world, this elaborate world of performed hospitality and concealed intention, that gave the Borgia legend its most enduring theatrical setting, and it was against this backdrop, the soft flicker of candlelight on the faces of men who had every reason to be careful about what they accepted from a Borgia hand, that the reputation of the family was built, legend by letter, by whispered diplomatic dispatch, over the long decade of Alexander's pontificate. Pope Alexander VI's reign formally began in August of 1492, and in the early years of his pontificate he demonstrated a competence and an energy that his more hostile contemporaries were sometimes reluctant to acknowledge, but that the documentary record makes difficult to deny. He restored a degree of order to a Rome that had grown unruly in the final years of Innocent V's papacy. He addressed the theological crisis posed by Christopher Columbus's return from the New World by issuing the Inter Caetera Bull of 1493, which divided the newly discovered territories between Spain and Portugal with a line drawn across the Atlantic at a specific meridian, an act of breathtaking geopolitical confidence that treated the entire undiscovered world as a thing to be distributed by papal decree. He engaged with the ongoing crisis posed by the Ottoman advance into Eastern Europe, and he maintained an active correspondence with the rulers of Christendom on matters of theology, politics, and mutual interest. He was, in other words, a pope who worked, a pope who governed, a pope whose administrative intelligence was real, and whose understanding of the machinery of the church was deep and genuine. And this fact, the fact of his genuine competence, is important for understanding the full complexity of a reign that was also, and unmistakably, marked by favoritism, by nepotism, and by the steady accumulation of wealth and power by members of the Borgia family at the expense of a church whose spiritual mission was, at least in theory, the reason for its existence. The cardinals who had voted against Rodrigo Borgia's election in August of 1492 had done so for reasons that mixed the personal and the principled in the way that such reasons generally do, and among the most vocal of the skeptics was Giovanni de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was reported to have said upon learning of Rodrigo's election, "Now we are in the power of a wolf, the most rapacious, perhaps, that this world has ever seen, and if we do not flee, he will infallibly devour us." This observation, whether it was recorded accurately or not, captures something of the feeling that attended Alexander's accession. A feeling of unease, of apprehension, of the sense that something was beginning that could not easily be stopped. A sense that would prove, in the years that followed, to be not entirely without foundation. The cardinals who had accumulated wealth over long careers in the church were particularly aware that Alexander had a habit of targeting wealthy ecclesiastics, inviting them to dine, and finding, in the days or weeks that followed, that they had died, and that their estates and benefices had reverted, as church law provided, to the Pope. The accusation that Alexander poisoned 5 cardinals for their wealth is recorded in contemporary sources, and while the precise truth of this accusation remains, as historians note, impossible to verify, The fact that it was made and believed and repeated across Europe in the diplomatic correspondence of the period tells us something real about the atmosphere of Alexander's Rome, an atmosphere in which death was always near, always plausible, and never entirely beyond the range of calculation. During this period, the Borgia family's grip on Rome and on the surrounding regions of the papal states was consolidated through a combination of methods that ranged from the entirely conventional to the considerably less so, and through all of it ran the question of Lucrezia, the daughter, the sister, the wife, the bride, the pawn, the subject of so much legend and so little certainty. In 1491, before her father became pope, the 11-year-old Lucrezia had been betrothed successively to two Spanish noblemen, a standard dynastic arrangement of the kind that was made, and unmade with regularity in the political world of the period, subject to the shifting tides of alliance and interest that made permanent commitments, difficult and provisional ones, necessary. But after August of 1492, after the elevation of her father to the throne of St. Peter, Lucrezia's matrimonial value increased dramatically, because she was now not simply the daughter of a powerful cardinal, but the daughter of the Pope himself, and a marriage alliance with a Borgia was now a marriage alliance with the most powerful office in Christendom. And so in the autumn of 1493, at the age of 13, Lucrezia Borgia was married to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a match that allied the Borgias with the powerful Sforza family of Milan. And that sent the young girl northward to the Adriatic coast, to a small provincial court, where the evenings were quieter and the horizons narrower than anything she had known in Rome, to begin her life as a political instrument in her father's elaborate and restless game. The marriage to Giovanni Sforza was, from the beginning, a somewhat fragile construction, resting on an alliance that was itself in the process of shifting, and by the mid-1490s, the political calculations that had recommended the match had been overtaken by new calculations that pointed in a different direction. Alexander had moved toward an alliance with the Aragonese kingdom of Naples, which placed the Borgias in opposition to Milan, and therefore in an uncomfortable relationship with the Sforza family, to which Lucrezia had been given in marriage. Giovanni Sforza, sensing the danger of his position, with the acuity of a man who had reason to fear for his life, fled from Rome in 1497, leaving Lucrezia behind in an ambiguous situation that was resolved, with the particular ruthlessness that characterized Alexander's approach to inconvenient obstacles, by an annulment obtained on the grounds of non-consummation of the marriage, a claim that Giovanni Sforza furiously contested and which he retaliated against by spreading the most damaging and scandalous rumors he could devise about the family that had used him, and then discarded him. The rumors that Giovanni Sforza spread, rumors of incest, rumors of moral depravity of various kinds, rumors that attached themselves to the Borgia name with the tenacity of smoke attaching itself to cloth, cannot be verified, and modern historians generally treat them as the revenge of a humiliated man, with a very good reason to damage those who had damaged him, but they circulated widely enough, and were repeated in enough different places to acquire a kind of independent life that has never entirely dissipated. The city of Rome in the late 1490s was a city living with a particular kind of tension, a low and persistent tension that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but something that contained elements of both. A sense that the rules of the game were being rewritten, that the familiar limits on what was possible in the pursuit of power had become somewhat less fixed than they had previously appeared to be, and that in the Vatican, in the candlelit apartments of a pope who worked late into the night and whose children moved through the city with an authority that had no obvious limit, something was being decided that would shape the world for years to come. The soft flicker of torchlight in the narrow streets near the Borgo, the quiet movement of armed men through the warm Roman night, the whispered conversations in the anterooms of palaces where important men waited for audiences that might bring them elevation or ruin. These were the textures of daily life in Alexander's Rome, and they formed the background against which the story of the Borgias' most consequential years would play itself out. It was in this atmosphere, in this Rome, in the last years of the 15th century, that the legend of the Borgia poisoner, real, exaggerated, and entirely impossible to fully separate from either the truth or the myth, took its final and enduring shape, settling like a fine pale powder into the fabric of European historical memory, where it has remained ever since, quietly present, waiting to be examined in the soft and thoughtful light of a quiet night, by a voice that speaks slowly, and by a listener whose eyes are growing heavy, and whose breathing is becoming, with every passing moment, a little more slow, a little more even, a little more like sleep. It was the year 1499, and it was the city of Rome, and it was the beginning of what historians have come to regard as the most active, and in many respects, the most consequential period of the entire Borgia ascendancy, a period in which the ambitions that had been carefully nursed across the preceding decades were finally given full expression in the form of military campaigns, political marriages, and the systematic reshaping of the map of central Italy according to a vision that was, in its essential outlines, the vision of a father and a son working in such close coordination that it was sometimes difficult for contemporaries to tell where the Pope's will ended and Cesare's began. Cesare Borgia had returned from France in the spring of 1499 with his new title of Duke of Valentinois, with a French army promised to him by Louis XII, with a marriage that was already more symbolic than domestic, and with the particular focused energy of a man who has at last been given permission to become what he has always believed himself to be. He was 23 years old, and the Romagna lay before him like a landscape waiting to be organized, like a collection of small lordships and ancient families, whose time, he had decided, was simply over. The lords of the Romagna, the Riario of Imola and Forlì, the Malatesta of Rimini, the Manfredi of Faenza, the Verano of Camerino, the da Montefeltro of Urbino, had each maintained their small courts and their local authority under the nominal suzerainty of the papacies for generations, and each of them now looked northward at the approaching Borgia army with a mixture of apprehension and the particular kind of desperate calculations that attends the recognition that one's situation is probably already beyond saving. The soft footfall of an approaching army on a dusty autumn road, the distant gleam of armor in the pale light of an October morning, the quiet burning of watchfires along the ridgelines of the Apennines. These were the sensory details against which the final years of those small, independent lordships were lived out, and they were details that the chroniclers of the period recorded with a vividness that suggests the experience of living through them was not one that anyone present forgot. Cesare's first campaign in the Romagna began in the autumn of 1499, and it proceeded with a speed and a decisiveness that surprised even those who had been watching him closely and had some sense of his capabilities. The city of Imola fell in November of 1499, surrendering after a brief siege to a force that was both larger and more professionally equipped than anything the local garrison could effectively resist. And this first conquest established a pattern: swift movement, overwhelming force, the offer of relatively moderate terms to those who surrendered promptly, and the implications of considerably less moderate treatment for those who did not. That would characterize the Borgia military operations throughout the Romagna campaigns. For Lee, the neighboring city was ruled by Caterina Sforza, a woman of remarkable tenacity and considerable political intelligence, who was also the niece of Lodovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, and who had already demonstrated, in an earlier crisis in 1488, that she was not a person who surrendered easily or without a fight. Caterina held the city briefly against Cesare's forces, and then retreated to the fortress of Ravaldino, where she held out through the winter months of late 1499 and into January of 1500, conducting the defense of her position with a courage and a stubbornness that was widely admired, even by those who expected her ultimately to lose, which she did in January of 1500, when the fortress fell and Caterina Sforza was taken prisoner and brought to Rome, where she was held in the Castel Sant'Angelo before eventually being released and permitted to retire to Florence, where she lived out the remaining years of her life in relative quiet. It is worth noting that among the men who served in Cesare Borgia's entourage during this period was a Florentine diplomat and political theorist named Niccolo Machiavelli, who was sent by the Republic of Florence to observe and report on Cesare's operations in the Romagna, and who watched with a kind of fascinated attentiveness that would eventually find its expression in a short book called The Prince, in which Cesare Borgia appears as something very close to the model of the ideal ruler. A man who understood that fortune was a force to be mastered, that power had its own logic, and that hesitation and sentiment were luxuries that a prince could not afford. Machiavelli encountered Cesare Borgia at several points during the years of the Romagna campaigns, and the impression that Cesare made upon him was clearly deep and lasting. Because even years later, writing in the enforced leisure of political exile in the Florentine countryside, Machiavelli returned again and again to the figure of Cesare as an example of a particular kind of political intelligence: cold, clear-eyed, systematic, unsentimental, that he regarded as the essential quality of effective rule. Their most significant encounter took place in the summer and autumn of 1502, when Machiavelli was sent to Cesare's court at Imola as a Florentine envoy, during a period of particular tension when several of Cesare's own captains, including Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo and Paolo and Francesco Orsini, had combined against him in what became known as the Conspiracy of Magione, named for the lakeside castle in Umbria, where the conspirators met in October of 1502 to plan their rebellion against the lord they had begun to fear. The conspiracy was, from the outside, a considerable threat. It represented the defection of experienced military commanders who knew Cesare's methods and who had the military capacity to cause him real difficulty. But Cesare's response to it was so calculated and so perfectly executed that it became, in Machiavelli's telling, a masterclass in the management of threat. Cesare appeared to negotiate, to reconcile, to invite the conspirators back into his confidence with gestures of warmth and offers of renewed alliance. And then, on the night of the 31st of December, 1502, at a meeting in the town of Senigallia on the Adriatic coast, that the conspirators had been led to believe was a formal ceremony of reconciliation, he had them arrested, and Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo were strangled that same night, while the Orsini brothers were held prisoner and killed in the weeks that followed. Machiavelli was close enough to witness the aftermath of this event, close enough to feel the particular quality of the silence that followed the removal of men who had been, only days before, powerful figures moving through the world with all the confidence of those who believe themselves to be safe. And what he felt, recorded in the letters he sent back to Florence, was something that mixed admiration and unease in proportions that he himself may not have been entirely able to calculate. The campaigns in the Romagna were not only military operations, but also, in a sense that Cesare seems to have understood quite clearly, exercises in governance. Attempts to demonstrate that the rule of the Borgias was not merely the rule of the conqueror, but something that might, over time, develop into something more like legitimate administration. Cesare appointed a Spanish administrator named Ramiro de Lorca, sometimes written as Ramiro de Lorqua, to govern the newly conquered territories, and Ramiro administered them with a severity that reduced disorder, but also generated considerable resentment among the local population, employing the kinds of methods that effective but brutal administrators have always employed in occupied territories. Swift punishment, the systematic suppression of resistance, the use of fear as a management tool. Then, in the last days of December 1502, in another of those gestures that Machiavelli found so instructive, Cesare had Ramiro arrested, had him executed, and had his body displayed in the central piazza of Cesena, cut in two, the chronicles record, with a bloody knife placed beside the pieces, as a demonstration that the excesses of the previous administration were not sanctioned by the Duke himself, that justice was being done, and that the people of the Romagna could expect, under Borgia rule, a government that was firm, but not gratuitously cruel. Whether this gesture was sincere or purely theatrical, whether Cesare genuinely disapproved of Ramiro's methods, or simply found him useful as a political sacrifice, is a question that the available evidence does not allow us to answer with any certainty, and historians have debated it across the centuries, with the particular inconclusive energy that attends questions whose answer depends on knowing what was in someone's heart rather than what was in their dispatches. Leonardo da Vinci entered the Borgia story in the summer of 1502, when Cesare, who was by this point the master of a substantial territory in central Italy, and the holder of an authority that required, among other things, the maintenance and improvement of the fortifications and roads and waterworks of the Romagna, engaged the services of the 50-year-old Florentine artist and engineer as his military architect and general inspector of fortifications. The relationship between Leonardo and Cesare is one of those historical connections that seems almost too rich with symbolic possibility to be entirely comfortable. The greatest artist and polymath of the age, in the service of the most ruthless political operator of his generation, travelling through the towns of the Romagna with a sketchbook and a set of instruments, making maps and surveys and engineering assessments for a lord whose methods Leonardo must have observed with the same dispassionate clarity that he brought to the study of anatomy and the movement of water. Leonardo's notebooks from this period contain maps of the Romagna cities, Imola, Cesena, Rimini, drawn with a precision and a care that reflects both his extraordinary technical gift and the seriousness with which he took his commission. And the map of Imola that he produced during this period is considered by historians of cartography to be one of the most remarkable documents of Renaissance geographic art, a bird's-eye view of extraordinary accuracy, drawn at a time when the instruments available for such work were primitive and the techniques for using them were only beginning to be systematized. The connection between the two men lasted approximately a year, and then Leonardo returned to Florence, and Cesare continued his campaigns, and the notebooks moved on to other subjects, other skeletons, other studies of birds in flight and water flowing through channels. And the brief intersection of their stories settled back into the historical record like two rivers that have briefly merged and then diverged, each carrying forward some sediment of the other. Meanwhile, in Rome, as Cesare's campaigns reshaped the Romagna with the methodical energy of a man who knows exactly what he wants and has the military and political resources to pursue it, Lucrezia's life was following its own complicated trajectory through the arrangements and rearrangements of Borgia dynastic policy. After the annulment of her marriage to Giovanni Sforza in 1497, Lucrezia had been briefly engaged to Alfonso of Aragon, Count of Bisegli, the illegitimate son of the King of Naples, and this second marriage, contracted in 1498, seems to have been, unlike the first, something that Lucrezia herself embraced with genuine warmth. Alfonso of Aragon was young, 17 at the time of the marriage to Lucrezia's 18, and was described by contemporaries as handsome and gentle, and by the accounts that survive, he and Lucrezia developed a real affection for each other, the kind of ordinary human tenderness that the political machinery of the Borgia family could arrange for, but could not guarantee, and that it could not, when its interests shifted, be relied upon to protect. A son was born to them in November of 1499, christened Rodrigo, in honor of his papal grandfather, and for a brief period, the household of Lucrezia and Alfonso seems to have contained something that resembled as much as anything in that complicated world could resemble. Simple domestic happiness. The sound of a child in a Roman garden, the soft afternoon light through a palazzo window, the particular quiet that settles over a household where the inhabitants are, for the moment, content. But Alfonso of Aragon was caught in the same political crosscurrents that had destroyed Giovanni Sforza's usefulness to the Borgias, and as Cesare's alliance with France strengthened and the alliance with Naples weakened, Alfonso's position became steadily more precarious, and in July of 1500, he was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica by unknown assailants who left him badly wounded but alive. Alfonso of Aragon survived the initial attack on the steps of St. Peter's, and in the weeks that followed, Lucrezia and Alfonso's sister Sancia nursed him with a devotion that the records describe in terms that suggest genuine fear and genuine love working alongside each other in the confined space of a sick room in the Vatican, where the young man lay recovering from his wounds under the care of his family, while, outside the door, the world of Borgia politics continued its normal operations with the indifference of a machine that has no mechanism for sentiment. Lucrezia is said to have cooked Alfonso's food herself during this period, preparing it with her own hands, rather than accepting food prepared by others, in the explicit understanding that food prepared by unknown hands in a Borgia household was food that could not be entirely trusted. A detail that, whether or not it is precisely accurate, speaks volumes about the atmosphere of the Vatican in the summer of 1500, about the knowledge that everyone in that environment carried, about the possibilities that a meal could contain. Alfonso seemed to be recovering. He was sitting up, receiving visitors, discussing his plans for when he was well enough to leave his bed. And then on the 18th of August, 1500, Cesare Borgia's personal attendant, a man named Michelotto Corella, who served as Cesare's trusted instrument for the resolution of difficult human problems, entered Alfonso's sick room and strangled him in what was presented as a mercy killing to prevent Alfonso from recovering sufficiently to attempt revenge on those who had attacked him. Though the logic of this explanation is, to say the very least, the logic of a world in which the ordinary moral grammar of human life had been replaced by something considerably more pragmatic and considerably less gentle. Alfonso was 19 years old when he died, and Lucrezia, by the accounts of those who observed her in the weeks that followed, was deeply sorrowful, withdrawn from the social life of the Vatican, grieving in a way that was described by the Venetian ambassador as genuine and unperformed. The death of Alfonso of Aragon marked something in Lucrezia's story, a kind of threshold or turning point after which the narrative of her life began to move in a different direction, away from Rome and away from the immediate shadow of her father and brother toward a new life in the north of Italy that would eventually prove to be, for all its political origins, something closer to her own. In the summer of 1501, Alexander VI negotiated a third marriage for Lucrezia, this time with Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, a match that represented a considerable diplomatic achievement for the papacy, since the Este family were one of the oldest and most prestigious dynasties in Italy and had initially shown considerable reluctance to accept a Borgia bride, given what was already being said about the family across the peninsula. The negotiations were complex and protracted, involving substantial financial inducements from the papacy and considerable internal debate within the Este family and Ferrara's Duke Ercole. I was ultimately persuaded less by affection for the Borgias than by the financial terms on offer and the practical political advantage of a papal alliance. Lucrezia was 21 years old when she left Rome in January of 1502, travelling northward through the Italian countryside in a procession of extraordinary magnificence. More than 1,000 people in her train, including musicians and ladies-in-waiting and ambassadors and servants, and the various representatives of the families and states that wished to be seen paying honour to a Borgia bride. And the accounts of her progress northward describe a journey that took on the quality of a public spectacle, with crowds gathering in the towns and villages along the route to observe the passage of this young woman, whose name they had all heard, whose reputation they knew something of, and whose face, by the accounts of those who saw it, was beautiful and composed, and gave away very little of whatever she was feeling as she travelled away from everything she had known. Ferrara was a different world from Rome, and the Este court at Ferrara was a world of genuine intellectual and artistic distinction, a world of poets and musicians and philosophers, of a tradition of patronage that had produced some of the most significant literary and artistic work of the 15th century, including the court of Leonello d'Este, which had been one of the great centres of humanist scholarship in the 1440s, and the patronage of the poet Matteo Maria Boiardo, whose Orlando Innamorato had been composed under Este sponsorship. It was into this world, quiet, cultivated, somewhat provincial by comparison with Rome, but deeply serious in its engagement with learning and art, that Lucrezia arrived in February of 1502, and it was in this world that she would, over the following years, gradually build a life that was recognizably her own, less determined by the calculations of her father and brother, more shaped by her own genuine interests and her own developing relationships. Her husband Alfonso was not initially particularly enthusiastic about the marriage, and the court of Ferrara was not universally welcoming. Duke Ercole's letters from this period contain passages that historians have read as thinly veiled expressions of unease about his new daughter-in-law and the family she represented. But Lucrezia had the intelligence and the social grace to navigate these difficulties with patience, and over months, and then years, the atmosphere of the Est Court toward her gradually warmed, as the expected scandal failed to materialize, and as Lucrezia demonstrated that she was quite capable of being the kind of duchess that Ferrara needed. The distant toll of a church bell across the flat plains of the Po Valley, the evening light on the brick towers of the Este Palace, the quiet movement of gondolas on the canals that ran through the city. These were the sounds and images of a life that was, in its day-to-day texture, very different from the violent political theatre of Rome. Back in Rome, as Lucrezia began her new life in Ferrara, the world of the Vatican under Alexander VI was entering a period that would prove to be its final, and in some ways its most intense phase. The year 1503 opened with the papacy at the height of its territorial ambitions, with Cesare's conquests in the Romagna apparently secure and expanding, with the Borgia family's grip on the institutions of the church unprecedented in its thoroughness, and with Alexander himself in his 72nd year, still active and still formidably intelligent, but carrying, in the physical weight of age, the inevitable suggestion that the extraordinary edifice he and his family had constructed rested ultimately on the continued health of a single old man whose body, however resilient, could not maintain its strength indefinitely. The summer of 1503 was, by the accounts of contemporaries, exceptionally hot, even by the standards of a Roman summer. And the Tiber ran low, and the streets smelled, as they always did in summer, of the 1,000 small biological processes that a city of 60,000 people generates in the absence of adequate sanitation, and the mosquitoes that bred in the marshes around the city carried in their small bodies the invisible agents of malaria, which the people of Rome called the bad air malaria, without yet understandings what precisely caused the fevers and the chills and the progressive weakness that it produced in those who contracted it. In the first days of August 1503, both Pope Alexander VI and Cesare Borgia fell ill, apparently simultaneously, following a dinner at the villa of Cardinal Adriano Castellesi di Corneto on the 6th of August, a coincidence that contemporaries found, and that historians have continued to find, suggestive, though the precise medical explanation for what happened at that dinner has never been definitively established. The illness that struck both Alexander and Cesare in August of 1503 was described by the physicians of the period in terms that modern medical historians have analyzed with considerable care, looking for the characteristic signs of specific diseases or specific toxic exposures in the language of records that were written without the benefit of germ theory or toxicological analysis. Alexander's physicians noted high fever, the accumulation of fluid in the abdomen, progressive weakness, and a discoloration of the skin that they described in terms suggesting jaundice. And these symptoms, taken together, are consistent with a severe malarial infection, which was endemic in Rome, and had killed numerous popes and cardinals and ordinary Romans across the centuries, though they are also consistent with certain forms of acute poisoning, a possibility that contemporaries raised immediately, and that has never entirely been dismissed, though most modern historians consider malaria or another febrile illness to be the most likely cause. Pope Alexander VI died on the 18th of August 1503 in the Vatican, attended by his physicians and by the members of his household at the age of 72, After a papacy of 11 years that had been, by any measure, one of the most turbulent and most consequential in the history of the Church. Cesare, whose illness had been equally severe, but whose youth and physical strength gave him a resilience that his father's aged body no longer possessed, survived, though the illness left him weakened for weeks and perhaps permanently damaged the extraordinary physical vitality that had been one of his most notable characteristics. The death of Alexander VI was for Cesare a catastrophe of the first order because the entire structure of his power, the military authority, the political appointments, the network of alliances and obligations, rested ultimately on the papal office that had created it, and without a Borgia on the throne of St. Peter, without his father's absolute support and his father's institutional authority, the edifice that Cesare had spent 5 years constructing began, with the particular quiet inevitability of structures built on foundations that were always more contingent than they appeared, to come apart. The death of Alexander VI sent a shockwave through the political world of Italy and through the wider world of European politics that had been watching the Borgia experiment, with a mixture of fascination, apprehension, and in some quarters barely concealed relief. In Rome, the reaction was immediate and in places quite ugly. The Orsini and Colonna families, whose power the Borgias had spent years suppressing, moved to reclaim their influence, almost before the Pope's body had grown cold, and various chroniclers record scenes of disorder in the city. As the careful arrangements of Alexander's reign dissolved in the absence of the force that had maintained them, the conclave that followed Alexander's death produced, after a very brief pontificate by Pius III that lasted only 26 days, the election of Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere as Pope Julius II in November of 1503, and Giuliano della Rovere was a man who had spent years in exile, partly to escape the influence of Alexander VI, who had opposed Rodrigo Borgia's election in 1492, and who had no particular inclination to preserve the arrangements that the Borgias had put in place. Julius II was also a man of formidable will and considerable military ambition himself, a pope who would eventually be known as the warrior pope for his personal participation in military campaigns, and who understood that a strong papacy required not the kind of family-centered nepotism that Alexander had practiced, but a more institutionally grounded form of authority that did not depend on a single family's continued dominance. For Cesare, the election of Julius II was the definitive closing of the door that his father's death had opened a crack. Julius had no reason to support him, several reasons to oppose him, and the political and military resources to make that opposition effective. Cesare Borgia spent the months following his father's death in a state of progressive political disintegration that was all the more poignant for those who observed it closely, because it happened to a man who had so recently appeared to be at the height of his powers, a man whose intelligence and will had seemed, in the years of the Romagna campaigns, to be more than adequate to meet whatever difficulties the world could present. The territories he had conquered began to slip away. Some were reclaimed by the papacy under Julius. Others were recovered by the local families he had displaced. And the careful architecture of the Duchy of Romagna, which had been such a significant accomplishment, and which Machiavelli had observed with such admiring attention, was dismantled with a speed that suggested how much of its apparent permanence had rested on the unique conditions of Alexander's pontificate. Cesare was arrested by the Spanish viceroy in Naples in the spring of 1504, held for a period, escaped, was captured again, and eventually found himself a prisoner in the castle of La Mota in Spain. In the kingdom of Castile, as far removed as it was possible to be from the Italian theatres in which he had made his name. He escaped from La Mota in October of 1506, fled to the Kingdom of Navarre, where his brother-in-law Jean d'Albret was king through his marriage to Cesare's wife, Charlotte's brother, and took service with the Navarrese king in a conflict that was, by any comparison with the campaigns of the Romagna, very much a minor affair, a small war between small powers over questions that had no significance beyond the immediate horizon of a small Pyrenean kingdom. And it was there, in the Kingdom of Navarre, at the siege of the small town of Viana, on the 12th of March, 1507, that Cesare Borgia was killed, ambushed by a group of knights in a narrow pass, unhorsed, and killed with multiple lance wounds, while his escort rode on ahead, without realizing what was happening, leaving him alone in the dust of a Spanish road, at the age of 31, and in the particular way that lives which have burned very brightly sometimes end. The ending came without ceremony, without the grandeur that the preceding years might have suggested it deserved, in a place that was very far from Rome, and very far from the candle-lit halls where he had once been, briefly, one of the most feared men in Europe. The news of Cesare Borgia's death at Viana on the 12th of March, 1507, travelled slowly through the network of couriers and diplomatic dispatches that connected the kingdoms and city-states of Europe in that era, moving from Navarre into France, and then southward into Italy, arriving in Ferrara perhaps weeks after the event itself, carried by some anonymous rider who handed a letter to a servant at a gate and rode on without ceremony. And it is worth pausing for a moment in the imagination of that arrival, of the letter being opened in a room in the Este Palace, on a quiet morning in early spring, of Lucrezia Borgia reading the words that told her that her brother, the brother who had ordered the strangling of her second husband, the brother who had been the most dangerous and the most brilliant person in her immediate family, the brother whose shadow had fallen over her entire life in Rome, was gone, killed in a skirmish in a country that was barely part of the world she had known. At 31 years old, before his story had reached anything resembling a conclusion. Lucrezia was 26 years old in the spring of 1507, and she had already outlived 2 marriages, a father, and now a brother, and the life she was building in Ferrara was by this point genuinely her own, in a way that her Roman years had never quite been, shaped less by the designs of others, and more by her own growing confidence in who she was and what she valued. She had become, in the 5 years since her arrival in Ferrara, a respected and even beloved figure in the Este court, a patroness of poets and scholars, a woman of genuine learning, who corresponded with some of the leading literary figures of her age, including Pietro Bembo, the great Venetian humanist and future cardinal, with whom she exchanged a series of letters in the early years of her time in Ferrara that were remarkable for their intellectual warmth and their evident mutual regard. Letters that were preserved and eventually published, and that revealed, to later centuries, a Lucrezia quite different from the legend that her family's reputation had created around her. Pietro Bembo's letters to Lucrezia, preserved in various archives, describe a woman of considerable wit and genuine literary sensibility, a woman who read Latin and who engaged seriously with the philosophical and poetic questions of her day, and who was, in the particular texture of her daily intellectual life, very far indeed from the poisoning temptress of popular imagination. The Este court at Ferrara in the early 16th century was one of the great centres of Italian Renaissance culture, and it was in this setting, surrounded by poets and musicians and scholars, by the soft afternoon light of the Po Valley, by the particular quality of intellectual seriousness that the Est family had cultivated across generations. That Lucrezia Borgia spent the most peaceful and, in some respects, the most genuinely fulfilled years of her life. Her marriage to Alfonso d'Este, which had begun with such mutual coolness and such political awkwardness, developed over the years into something that functioned, if not always as a love match in the romantic sense, then at least as a genuine and mutually respectful partnership between two people who had found in each other a degree of compatibility that neither had entirely expected. Alfonso was a man of notably practical temperament, more interested in artillery and ceramics than in poetry and philosophy, more comfortable in a workshop than in a salon, a person whose intellectual gifts ran in quite different directions from his wife's. But he was also, by the accounts that survive, a man of some steadiness and some loyalty. And his relationship with Lucrezia, which produced several children over the years, seems to have been characterized by a respect that, in a world where dynastic marriages were rarely expected to be more than politically functional, counted for something real. They had children together. Ercole, born in 1508, who would eventually become Duke of Ferrara as Ercole Sue, and several others who did not survive infancy or early childhood, as was so tragically common in an era when the medical understanding of childhood illness was still very far from adequate to the task of preventing the losses that families of all social levels experienced, with what we, looking back, can only describe as heartbreaking regularity. The pregnancies and the losses marked Lucrezia's years in Ferrara with a rhythm of hope and grief that was the private counterpoint to the more public life of patronage and court ceremony and the documents of this period. The letters she wrote, the records of her household, the accounts of her activities, suggest a woman who was genuinely engaged with her life, who found pleasure in music and reading, who managed the practical affairs of her household with intelligence and care, and who was, in the gradual way that people become who they are over the long middle years of a life, becoming someone quite different from the young girl who had left Rome in January of 1502. In a procession of 1,000 people, the world of Renaissance Italy in the years following Alexander VI's death was undergoing a series of transformations that would, over the following decades, fundamentally reshape the political and cultural landscape that the Borgias had inhabited, and in certain ways helped to create. Pope Julius II, who reigned from 1503 to 1513, was in many ways the antithesis of Alexander, where Alexander had used the church's resources to advance his family. Julius used them to advance the institutional power of the papacy itself, waging military campaigns in the Romagna and elsewhere to recover territories lost to various local lords, commissioning Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and Raphael to decorate the papal apartments, and generally presiding over what historians have come to regard as one of the most culturally productive pontificates of the Renaissance. It was during the pontificate of Julius II, and then of Leo X, who was none other than the Giovanni de' Medici, who had famously warned that Rome was now in the power of a wolf when Alexander was elected, that the great flowering of high Renaissance art and culture in Rome reached its fullest expression. The years of Michelangelo and Raphael and Bramante, the years of the Stanza della Segnatura and the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, the years in which Rome became, for a brief and extraordinary period, the unambiguous center of European civilization. The Borgias had been part of this world, had in their way contributed to it. Alexander had been a patron of art and architecture in his own right, commissioning significant works including the Pinturicchio frescoes in the Borgia apartments of the Vatican, which still exist and which depict members of the Borgia family amid scenes of theological and allegorical significance. But their contribution had been overshadowed in the historical memory by the louder and more dramatic story of their political ruthlessness, their alleged poisonings, and the particular kind of notoriety that tends to attach itself to a family that combines great power with a great disregard for conventional limits. The legend of the Borgias as poisoners began to accumulate its most enduring literary and cultural form in the decades immediately following their decline from power, in the pamphlets and histories and diplomatic memoirs that circulated among the literate classes of Italy and France and Spain in the early 16th century, and it is in this process of legend formation, this slow accretion of story upon story, that the history of the family becomes almost impossible to separate cleanly from the mythology. The Venetian diarist Marino Sanudo, who kept a meticulous and voluminous record of events and rumours throughout his long life, recorded numerous stories about the Borgias that mixed verified fact with hearsay and embellishment, in the proportions that contemporaneous gossip has always employed, and his diaries, which run to many volumes, and which cover the period of the Borgia ascendancy in considerable detail, are among the most important primary sources for the period, while also being among the most unreliable in their specific claims, because Sanudo recorded what he heard as well as what he verified, and what he heard was often coloured by the political animosities and personal prejudices of whoever was doing the talking. The historian and diplomat Francesco Guicciardini, whose Storia d'Italia, begun around 1537 and completed posthumously, is one of the great works of Renaissance historiography, wrote about the Borgias with a cold and sweeping contempt that has shaped the received image of the family for centuries, condemning Alexander for simony, nepotism, and murder, and describing the entire Borgia enterprise as a sustained exercise in the corruption of sacred office for secular ends. Guicciardini was a man of considerable intelligence and historical acuity, and his judgments carry real weight. But he was also a Florentine of the merchant aristocracy, writing in the shadow of experiences. The French invasions, the collapse of the Italian state system, the sack of Rome in 1527, that had left his generation with a particular bitterness about the world they had inherited, and his portrait of the Borgias, while not without foundation, is a portrait painted with a brush dipped in the ink of that bitterness. Meanwhile, in Ferrara, Lucrezia's life continued to unfold in its quiet rhythm of patronage and pregnancy, of court ceremony and private correspondence, of the management of a ducal household, and the cultivation of relationships that were, increasingly, the relationships of a woman who had made her peace with the world she was living in, and had found within it a sufficient number of things worth caring about. She became close to the Ferrarese poets and writers of her circle, including Lodovico Ariosto, whose great chivalric epic Orlando Furioso was composed in part during this period, and who would have been a presence in the Este court, moving through the same rooms and gardens where Lucrezia spent her days. She maintained her correspondence with friends and relatives across Italy, managed the substantial financial affairs of her household with practical intelligence, and in the years after Alfonso became Duke of Ferrara, following his father Ercol's death in 1505, she performed the ceremonial and diplomatic functions of a ruling duchess with a grace that, by the accounts of foreign ambassadors and visitors, made a consistently favourable impression. There is, in the documents of Lucretius Ferrari's years, a quality of settled attention, a sense of a person who has found her footing and is no longer being moved quite so decisively by forces outside her control, and this quality, this gradual achievement of something like autonomy within the constraints that the world of the Renaissance had assigned to women, of her station, is perhaps the most genuinely moving aspect of her story, more moving, in some ways, than the dramatic events of her Roman years, precisely because it is quieter and more ordinary and more recognizably human. She died in Ferrara on the 24th of June, 1519, at the age of 39, following complications from the delivery of her last child, who did not survive, and she was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini in Ferrara, where her tomb was marked by a simple inscription that said nothing about her father, or her brother, or the extraordinary circumstances of her early life, but simply recorded her name and the dates of her birth and death, and her titles as Duchess of Ferrara. The question of what Cantarella actually was, and whether it was used as frequently and as deliberately as legend insisted, is one that has occupied medical historians and toxicologists with some regularity across the centuries, since the Borgia era, and the careful and qualified answers that modern scholarship has produced are considerably less dramatic than the legend, but considerably more interesting as a window into the actual practice of chemistry and medicine in the Renaissance. The most thorough modern analysis of the question, published in academic toxicology literature, suggests that Cantarella was most likely a compound based on arsenic trioxide, the white powder known since antiquity as white arsenic or arsenious oxide, which was indeed the most commonly used poison in Renaissance Italy, and which had a number of properties that made it particularly well suited to the clandestine administration that contemporary accounts described. It was tasteless, or nearly so. It was soluble in water and wine. It had no immediate dramatic effect, and its symptoms in sublethal doses resembled those of various common illnesses, while in larger doses it produced gastrointestinal distress, fluid accumulation, neurological symptoms, and eventually organ failure, all of which could, in an era before chemical analysis, be attributed to natural disease. Whether the Borgias used it as systematically and as frequently as their contemporaries believed is, as the historians of the Wits University study noted, probably impossible to establish with certainty. The chemical testing that would have been required to confirm arsenic poisoning in a 15th century corpse was not available until the development of the Marsh test in 1836, more than 3 centuries after Alexander's death. And the symptoms that contemporaries attributed to Borgia poison were symptoms that natural illness could equally well produce in a city where malaria and typhoid and various other serious diseases were endemic, and where no natural death of a person of consequence was ever entirely free of the possibility of suspicion. The broader culture of poisoning in Renaissance Italy, of which the Borgia legend is the most famous expression, existed within a context of medical knowledge and alchemical practice that was itself in a period of significant transition, moving slowly and unevenly from a model grounded in ancient Greek and Roman texts. Dioscorides' De Materia Medica, Pliny's Natural History, the medical writings of Galen, towards something that would eventually become the empirical chemistry and pharmacology of later centuries, but that in the 15th and early 16th century was still deeply entangled with astrology, with the doctrine of humours, with the theory of elemental sympathies, and with a complex of ideas about the relationship between natural substances and the human body that we would now recognize as a mixture of genuine insight and elaborate misunderstanding. The apothecaries and pharmacists of Renaissance Italy, the specialis as they were called, operated shops that sold both medicines and poisons because the distinction between the two was, as it has always been, primarily a matter of dose and intention rather than of fundamental difference in the nature of the substance, and the overlap between medicinal and toxic knowledge was sufficiently significant that the prosecution of suspected poisoners in this period faced a persistent evidentiary problem. The presence of a particular substance in a household or on a person could not, by itself, establish the intent to poison, because the same substance might have entirely legitimate therapeutic uses. Arsenic itself was used medicinally in this period, in carefully controlled doses, for the treatment of certain skin conditions and fevers, and the knowledge of its properties was therefore distributed across a fairly wide range of practitioners and educated laypeople, none of whom could be assumed, merely by possessing it, to be planning a murder. The learned physician and alchemist Paracelsus, writing in the early 16th century, formulated the principle, still fundamental to modern pharmacology and toxicology, that the dose makes the poison, that any substance can be either beneficial or harmful depending on the quantity administered. And while Paracelsus was writing somewhat after the main period of Borgia activity, his formulation captured a truth that the herbalists and apothecaries and suspected poisoners of the preceding decades had been living with in practice without having yet articulated it with such clean theoretical precision. The philosophical and political legacy of the Borgia era was transmitted to later centuries, primarily through the work of Niccolò Machiavelli, whose observations of Cesare Borgia in the Romagna between 1499 and 1503 provided the most important raw material for the political theory that he would develop in The Prince, written in 1513 and circulated in manuscript during Machiavelli's lifetime before being published posthumously in 1532. The Prince is a short work, fewer than 100 pages in most modern editions, and it is a work whose reception across the 5 centuries since its composition has been almost as complicated and as contested as the reception of the Borgia family itself. Condemned as satanic, praised as realistic, read as a manual of tyranny and as a subtle critique of tyranny, understood as the foundation of modern political science, and as the codification of the worst impulses of Renaissance statecraft. What is clear, and what the text itself makes explicit, is that Cesare Borgia was for Machiavelli the closest approximation that actually existing history had yet produced of the kind of leader he was theorizing. A man who understood that fortune, which Machiavelli famously compared to a river prone to flooding, could be channeled and directed by the man who built embankments and dikes in advance, who prepared for contingency, who acted decisively rather than waiting for events to define his options. Cesare's failure, in Machiavelli's analysis, was not a failure of intelligence or will, but a failure of fortune. The bad fortune of falling gravely ill at precisely the moment when his father died, when his own physical presence and activity were most needed to manage the transition of papal power. Without that illness, Machiavelli suggested, Cesare might have been able to influence the conclave sufficiently to assure the election of a friendly pope, or at least to consolidate his territorial gains, before the new pontificate had time to move against him. The counterfactual is one of the more melancholy exercises in Renaissance historiography. The sense of a plan that was, in its essential architecture, more coherent and more capable than almost any of its contemporaries. Undone not by any failure of the plan itself, but by the intervention of a fever, of a body that simply could not, in its extremity of illness, do what the mind required of it. The reputation of the Borgia family in European cultural memory underwent a series of significant transformations across the centuries following their decline, moving through phases of condemnation and rehabilitation and renewed condemnation that reflected, as much as they reflected any accumulating understanding of the historical evidence, the particular cultural and political preoccupations of each successive era. In the 16th century, the Protestant reformers found in the story of Alexander VI a perfect illustration of the corruption of the Catholic Church, and writers from Luther onward used the Borgias as evidence for the necessity of the Reformation. The Pope, who had children, who used the Church's wealth to fund his family's conquests, who was alleged to have purchased the papacy itself through simony, was a gift to those who argued that the institution of the papacy had become an obstacle to genuine Christian life rather than its highest expression. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Borgias became figures of Baroque theatrical excess, appearing in operas and plays and romans as embodiments of Mediterranean passion and cruelty. The dark mirror of northern European virtue, the Catholic South rendered as a place of sensuous danger and elaborate moral hazard. In the 19th century, a more systematic approach to historical evidence began to complicate the simple narrative of Borgia wickedness. German historians, in particular, working in the tradition of Leopold von Ranke and his insistence on the primary sources, began to look more carefully at what the documents actually said, and to distinguish between what was documented and what was alleged, and the resulting scholarship, while it did not entirely exonerate the Borgias, did significantly qualify the most extreme accusations. The 20th century brought further revisionist work, including the scholarly biographies that sought to rescue Lucretia in particular from the legend that had been built around her, and the 21st century has produced, in addition to scholarly work, a considerable popular culture revival of Borgia-related narrative, from novels to television series, that has kept the family's name alive in the public imagination while continuing to blur, in ways that are almost inevitable in popular storytelling, the boundary between the historical and the legendary. The slow rehabilitation of Lucrezia Borgia's reputation in modern historiography is perhaps the most intellectually satisfying strand of the longer story of how the Borgia legend has been examined and revised over the centuries, because it illustrates with particular clarity how the same set of historical facts can be read radically different ways, depending on the frameworks of interpretation that one brings to them, and how the most durable legends are often the ones that most completely obscure the human reality beneath them. The Lucrezia of the legend, the beautiful poisoner, the incestuous daughter, the femme fatale of Renaissance darkness, was a construction built primarily from the malicious gossip of her discarded first husband Giovanni, Sforza from the political propaganda of her family's enemies, from the assumption, widespread in the misogynistic frameworks of the succeeding centuries, that a woman who was associated with powerful and unscrupulous men must herself be powerful and unscrupulous in ways that went beyond whatever the evidence could actually support. The Lucrezia of the historical documents, the letters, the financial records, the diplomatic dispatches, the accounts of her Ferrarese life, is a considerably more nuanced figure. A woman who was used as a political instrument throughout her girlhood, who survived 2 marriages, and the loss of a second husband she had genuinely loved. Who built a life in Ferrara that was, by the standards of her time, quite successful in its cultivation of learning and art, and who died at 39 after a life that was, in its essential character, more that of a cultivated Renaissance noblewoman than of a murderous schemer. The scholar Sarah Bradford, in her 2004 biography of Lucrezia, and the historian Marion Johnson, in her earlier study of the Borgia family, both contributed significantly to this revisionist project, drawing on archival sources in Ferrara and Rome to construct a portrait of Lucrezia that separated, as carefully as the evidence allowed, the woman from the legend. The process is not complete, and perhaps cannot be, because the legend has so thoroughly colonized the cultural space that the historical figure occupied, that they are now almost inextricably entangled, but the effort to make the separation, to look past the accumulated centuries of storytelling at the actual person who lived and breathed and wrote letters and had children and died in Ferrara on a summer day in 1519, is itself a meaningful act of historical imagination, a recognition that the people of the past were people, subject to the same confusions and the same losses and the same small daily pleasures as anyone who has ever lived. The physical world of Renaissance Italy, the material context in which the Borgia story unfolded, was a world of extraordinary sensory richness that deserves, in any account of the period, some direct attention, not as background decoration, but as a genuine dimension of historical experience, as the texture against which all the ambition and the violence and the patronage and the grief were actually lived. The cities of the Italian peninsula in the late 15th and early 16th centuries were simultaneously ancient and new, layered with the physical remnants of their Roman past. The broken columns and the fragments of aqueduct, the ruins of temples repurposed as churches or as quarries for building material, and energetically constructing their Renaissance present, building the palaces and churches and civic buildings that still, in many cases, define the visual character of Italian cities today. Rome in Alexander's time was a city of perhaps 60,000 people, smaller than it would become, and smaller than it had been in the ancient period, and it was in the process of being rebuilt according to the ambitions of successive popes who wanted their capital to reflect the dignity of their office, a project that required constant demolition and construction, the perpetual sound of hammers, and the smell of cut stone and fresh mortar, the dust of old buildings being taken apart to provide material for new ones. Ferrara, where Lucrezia spent the last 17 years of her life, was a smaller and quieter city, a city of canals and brick towers and wide straight streets, laid out according to a remarkable Renaissance urban planning scheme, the Addizione Erculea, planned by the architect Biagio Rossetti in the 1490s, that gave it a rationality and a spaciousness unusual among Italian cities of the period, a quality of geometrical calm that must have felt after Rome like a kind of relief. Florence, Milan, Naples, Venice, each of these cities had its own distinct character, its own particular relationship to the past and to the present, its own economy and its own culture, and its own way of organizing the relationship between the powerful and the less powerful, and the story of the Borgias moved through all of them, touched all of them in various ways, and was shaped by all of them in return, in the particular reciprocal relationship between individuals and their environments that makes history so much richer and so much more complicated than any simple narrative of great men and their decisions. The nature of political power in Renaissance Italy was a subject that fascinated the intellectuals of the period with an intensity that is difficult to fully appreciate from the distance of 5 centuries, because we live in a world where the basic vocabulary of political analysis, the state, sovereignty, legitimate authority, the separation of church and secular governance, has become so familiar as to seem natural, while in the Italy of 1490 or 1500, these concepts were still being worked out, still being discovered and articulated and tested against the evidence of political experience in ways that were genuinely uncertain and genuinely urgent. The Italian city-states had created, by the late 15th century, something like a laboratory for political experimentation, a space where different models of governance, the republic, the signoria, the duchy, the ecclesiastical principality, existed in close proximity and in constant competition, where the consequences of political choices were observable in relatively compressed time and space, and where the failure of a particular political arrangement could come quickly and visibly enough to be instructive to those with the intelligence and the detachment to observe it carefully. It was this laboratory and the particular richness of the political experience it had generated that gave Italian political thought of the period its distinctive quality of hard-edged realism, its insistence on looking at things as they were rather than as they ought to be, its willingness to acknowledge that the grammar of actual political life was not the grammar of the theological tradition or the philosophical tradition, but something rougher and more pragmatic, something that needed to be understood on its own terms. The Borgias were, in this context, not merely a family of unusually ambitious and unscrupulous people, but something like a stress test of the entire system, a demonstration of what happened when the institutions of spiritual authority were pressed into the service of purely secular ambition, when the mechanisms of the church were used with complete, unsentimental efficiency as tools of political advancement, and when the conventions and the tacit agreements that normally regulated competition among the powerful were simply set aside by people who had decided that the ordinary rules did not apply to them. The sound of church bells in Rome in the early 16th century was, for those who heard it, the primary means by which the city organized itself in time, the auditory marker of the hours and the seasons and the great cycles of the liturgical year, and it is worth resting for a moment in the imagination of that sound. The deep bronze resonance of the great bells of St. Peter's, the higher and lighter voices of the smaller parish churches scattered through the city, the way the sound would travel across the rooftops in the still air of an early morning, when the streets were not yet full of the ordinary noise of a city going about its day. It was in that soundscape, in that particular acoustic texture of a city, governed by the rhythm of religious time, that the Borgias had lived their extraordinary and terrible, and in some ways genuinely magnificent lives. And it was against that background, the bells and the candlelight, the scratch of quills on vellum in the Vatican chancery, the movement of armed men through cobbled streets at night, the smell of the Tiber in summer, and the particular clarity of the Roman winter air, that the story of a family's rise and fall had played itself out across the 11 years of Alexander's pontificate and the few years before and after. The beauty of that world and its violence were not separate things, but aspects of a single reality, a single place and time, in which extraordinary human creativity and extraordinary human ruthlessness existed not as contradictions, but as expressions of the same fundamental energy, the same restless insistence on making the world conform to the shape of one's own desires, that characterizes both the artist who will spend a decade on a ceiling and the politician who will spend a lifetime on a papacy. What the Borgias teach us, if they teach us anything, is not simply that power corrupts or that ambition is dangerous. Though these lessons are available in their story, as they are available in most stories of political life, they teach us something more particular and more interesting about the conditions under which the ordinary moral inhibitions that govern human behavior can be quietly suspended, about the way in which the institutionalization of power creates environments in which actions that would be unthinkable in private life come to seem not merely possible but necessary, and about the ease with which the language of sacred obligation can be made to serve the purposes of the most thoroughly secular ambition. And so the story of the Borgia settles, as all stories eventually do, into its place in the long and patient archive of human experience, joining the thousands of other stories of families and ambitions and institutions that have risen and fallen across the centuries, leaving behind them their documents and their buildings and their legends and their names, which continue to be spoken long after the people who bore them have returned to the earth from which they came. The Borgia apartments in the Vatican still exist, their walls painted with the frescoes that Pinturicchio completed for Alexander VI in the 1490s, and the rooms are open to visitors today, quiet rooms where the painted figures of the Borgia family, Rodrigo as a pope, Cesare perhaps as the figure of a young man in one of the allegorical scenes, and Lucretia, most historians believe, as the figure of Saint Catherine of Alexandria in the Disputation of the Doctors, look out from their walls with the calm and slightly remote expressions of people who have been translated from history into art, from the contingency of lived experience into the relative permanence of pigment and gold. Ferrara still stands, its brick towers and its wide straight streets still following the plan that Biagio Rossetti laid down in the 1490s, and the convent of Corpus Domini, where Lucretia was buried, still exists, though the precise location of her tomb was lost in the centuries of disruption and renovation that followed her death. In Navarre, on a hillside near the town of Viana, there is a marker where Cesare Borgia is said to have died, and it has become, quietly, over the years, a small place of historical pilgrimage, not a monument to greatness, exactly, but an acknowledgement of passage, a recognition that someone of significance died in this place, in this dust, on this particular hillside, alone. And in the libraries and archives of Rome and Ferrara and Venice and Madrid, in the collections of letters and dispatches and chronicles and diaries that the people of the Renaissance wrote with such extraordinary prolificacy, the raw material of the Borgia story continues to exist in its original form, waiting for the next reader who will come to it with patient eyes and the willingness to let the documents speak in their own voice, without the overlay of 500 years of legend, without the accumulated weight of everything that has been said and written and staged and filmed about this family, and to find there, in the faded ink and the imperfect Latin and the slightly breathless urgency of a diplomatic letter, written by candlelight in a Roman palazzo on a warm August evening in 1492, the particular quality of a world that was fully real and fully human and fully gone, and that exists now only in the act of being remembered, quietly, in the small hours of a night that is itself becoming, moment by moment, part of the past that it so gently carries. It is late now. The candles of the Renaissance have long since burned to nothing. The bells that rang across Rome in the age of Alexander VI have rung their last notes into the accumulated silence of 5 centuries, and the people who heard them, the cardinals in their red robes, The soldiers in the narrow streets, the scholars bent over their manuscripts, the young woman travelling northward through the Italian countryside in a procession of 1,000 people, wondering what her new life would be. Have all of them returned to the earth? Have all of them become, in the fullest and most irreversible sense, the past? The story we have followed together through these long hours has been a story of ambition and its consequences, of legend and the human reality beneath it, of the way that power shapes the people who hold it, and the people who live within its reach, of the quiet persistence of beauty in the midst of violence, of the extraordinary richness of a world that was also, in so many ways, deeply and consistently sorrowful. But it is also, and perhaps most essentially, a story about time, about the way that time softens even the sharpest events into the gentleness of history, the way that what was once urgent and terrible and immediate becomes, across the centuries, something that can be held at a careful and thoughtful distance, examined without the immediacy of fear, understood in its full complexity, rather than reacted to in the urgency of its unfolding. And here you are, at the far end of that time, safe in the present, in your bed, in your room, in the quiet world of a night that is simply a night, ordinary and sufficient, the darkness around you, gentle and without threat, your body settled into its rest, your breathing slow and even and untroubled. The Borgias are history now. The poison is centuries old. The bells have long been silent. And you are here, breathing, resting, letting the past drift back into its proper distance, soft and dark and far away, like candlelight seen through very old glass, like the distant sound of a bell heard in a dream, like the last few words of a story that has reached, at last, its quiet end.